Welcome. I'm Troy McKenzie, Dean of NYU School of Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to another edition of The Life of the Law. The concept for this series traces back to something that was said many years ago by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, who wrote, "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience." That much of what we learn about the law, frankly, is not in books, it's not diagrammed as a logical proof, but in the day-to-day experiences of people working their way through the legal system. Too often, the very real, distinctively unique stories that constitute the lives of those who shape the law fall out of the headlines long after cases have been decided. 50 years ago, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Frontiero against Richardson, which proved to be a landmark ruling in the cause of gender equality within the United States. The case was argued in part by a young law professor working with the American Civil Liberties Union by the name of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And much of the development of this area of law traces from the Frontiero decision by the Supreme Court. We have a unique opportunity this evening to hear the story firsthand from the plaintiff in the case, Sharon Cohen, who will be speaking with the Pulitzer Prize finalist, journalist Joshua Prager. For more than 20 years, Josh was a senior writer with the Wall Street Journal. He has written about historical secrets, revealing the hidden scheme that led to baseball's most famous moment, Bobby Thompson's shot heard round the world. For baseball fans like me, that was a revealing and slightly depressing thing to learn. He also has done a number of fascinating stories delving into the law, including his book, The Family Roe, which illuminates unknown stories and the people behind Roe against Wade. And that book offered to the public a unique glimpse into the abortion debate in America by laying out not just its social and legal context, but also very much its personal context. And for that book, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So before we get the conversation underway and I turn the microphone over to Josh, I just want to acknowledge the support for this series by Christopher Buck, who is the founder of Retro Report, which is a nonprofit news organization. He has been instrumental in conceiving of and supporting this series of events. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Josh and Sharon.
Thank you so much, Dean McKenzie. It's an honor to be here with you and with all of you. And thank you, Chris. You're not here tonight, but thank you so much for making this happen. And thank you, Sharon. I'm really excited to speak with you. She just brought a copy of my book and asked me to sign it. And I wrote in there that my life would have been a lot easier had I written about you instead of Norma McCorvey.
And I pointed out he doesn't know that yet.
Okay, so we'll see what happens. But thank you. It's really a delight to be here with you. So we'll start kind of at the beginning of your story. You were born in 1947, Sharon Perry. Mm-hmm. You grew up in Greenfield, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. We are starting at the beginning, aren't we?
Yep.
Okay.
Until middle school. You grew up in a blue-collar home, a Catholic home. Your parents were a car salesman and a secretary.
Yes.
And you were the first of 4 kids.
Yes.
And you told me that it was a difficult home to grow up in. The family split up and sort of moved about several times. Tell us a little bit about what was going on in your early years.
How many of you know him, by the way? A fair number, right? He's very easy to talk to. And I think we did 4 hours on the phone, which I count as therapy. So when he called, I grew up in a very alcoholic home. My father was an alcoholic. His father was an alcoholic. All of my father's siblings, there were 6 of them, were to one degree or another, from problem drinkers to the one whose name was almost officially, at least we don't drink like Roger. And, there was one in the middle who had gone to AA and tried to mentor Roger. But my sister actually died in a drinking binge. So I came from a very, very alcoholic home, as well as being very Catholic in the 1950s. And yes, it was troublesome. But when I started talking to Joshua, my sister died about 1.5 years ago, and she's my last alcoholic in my life. So I've been thinking about the role of alcohol in my life when you came along, because it's so much easier to think about it when you're not living it. I presume there are people in this room who know about alcoholism. So anyway, you got a lot of that. I have to say now that there were a lot of strengths in my family as well. It was a very big Catholic family. My mother was what I call a mitigating Catholic. I would come home from Catholic school and announce who was not going to heaven, and she would say, well, you don't have to discuss this with the nuns, but we don't believe that here. And my favorite, though, my mother's favorite, was when I became a teenager. I said to her, you and Aunt Betty, you use birth control. How do you deal with that in the confessional? And my mother said, the priests don't have to know everything. So, I had a mitigating mother, a really human being mother. So there were a lot of strengths. And yes.
I guess the reason...
Did I answer that?
Yeah, and the reason that I ask about childhoods when I speak to people is because often sort of the roots of who we are and what we do when we're older, especially at sort of turning points in our lives, they're often sort of, they trace back to our childhoods. And I think, one of the things you told me in this home, it was a complicated place. Your father ran off a few times, that you moved in with various folks. It was difficult, that you spoke your mind in the home. And if something bothered you, you spoke up.
Well,
right?
I was the oldest. I mean, I was the oldest. I was the one who went up against my father and then would be blamed by my sister, So I think I told you that I learned you're going to be damned if you do and damned if you don't, in some ways. We're getting to who sues, right? Why did I sue? What kind of person sues?
I guess eventually, yeah.
I can't skip ahead.
No, you can't skip ahead. Sorry.
All right.
We'll get there. But you mentioned your sister. You told me she was the pretty one. I was the smart one. That's what you said. And I think the way we see ourselves is often not exactly.
But you know what my mother said about that?
Tell me.
My mother said, "Get out of high school and it will never matter again." And she was right.
And when you got out of high school, you headed off to college. Were you the first girl in your family to head off to college?
In the whole extended family, I was the second of the cousins to go to college. And yes, the first girl.
Wow. Had you always known that this was something you wanted to do?
I wanted to be a physical therapist. My grandmother was a rehabilitation nurse. She was the most powerful person in the family. That seemed like a good route to go. So yes, I needed to go to college for it.
And that was the route you took. You went off to the University of Massachusetts, 1966. One of the things you really sort of impressed upon me was that in life, and certainly in your education, everything was predicated on being able to pay for it. Money was an enormous pressure
It was
for
all
you.
about money.
Yeah, so how did that manifest itself in college for you? What was life like?
Well, I paid for college myself, so I worked hard, and I can work hard. But my senior year, I applied for an Air Force Institute of Technology scholarship
Senior year of college.
of college, yes.
But before that, you lived with your grandparents?
I lived with my grandparents while I went to UMass, and then I transferred to the University of Connecticut to get the physical therapy degree.
They had a program that if you
Yeah.
if you lived there, you would get sort of in-state rates, or
Yeah, it was a reciprocal program among New England colleges,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And it was then 1968.
I could shave a dime. I really knew how to shave a dime in those days to make it work.
What did you eat?
Well, whatever my grandmother served, and it wasn't always good.
Yeah, well, you didn't have that luxury. And so 1968, you applied, as you just said, for a military scholarship.
Yeah.
And the idea for that was that it would help to pay for your last year of
Yeah.
school.
Yeah,
And
and got me a car, which was a huge luxury.
oh, really?
Yeah.
What kind of car?
Well, remember my father was a car salesman. I got a lavender convertible, the most ridiculous car, the most fun, most wonderful car I've ever owned.
What was it?
A lavender convertible. I don't know
mean,
what
what
kind.
kind of car?
I don't know what kind
Okay, a
it was.
lavender
I only
convertible.
know the color.
That's great. And you started as well in college. Before we move ahead, you started dating someone. You had a boyfriend.
Yeah, the boy back home. Yeah,
And
Joe.
tell us a little bit
Joe
about
Frontiero.
him. Joe Frontiero. You know his last name. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, tell us a little bit about him. What was it about him? Why did you date him?
You know, things ended badly between us. So,
Yes. Your last name is now Cohen.
yes, my last name is anything but Frontiero. So it's kind of hard to remember, but I'm sure he was a nice guy at the time.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
He was intelligent. He was, I was up from blue collar. I was very naive. I don't think I actually knew how to think. I knew how to work hard. I knew how to pass tests, but I didn't really know how to think or why anybody would even want to, And he was a man who knew how to think. He had ideas. He dragged me off to a Buckminster Fuller lecture, which blew my mind. He was intellectually exciting to me before I understood why and how.
were there people in your family who opened your mind sort of similarly, or this was all new?
This was new. This was new. My mother was a woman with. She was smart in ways, but not intellectually. She was smart with her heart. Yeah.
One thing I didn't think to ask you before, how is it that you didn't fall sort of victim to alcohol like so many other folks in your family did?
Luck.
Did you abstain, or did you
No,
just,
I drink.
It
And
just
occasionally drink a little too much. But, I'm kind of fortunate. If I drink too much, I just fall asleep. I just physically don't.
It didn't
drink
have
that
the
much.
same
Didn't have the same effect on me.
effect on you?
No.
I see. So 1969, you get this scholarship. You graduate University of Connecticut with a BS in physical therapy, and you report for duty. October 1969. Where did you head off to?
Montgomery, Alabama.
To an
There
Air
was,
Force base.
basic training in Texas, which was kind of fun. The Air Force, they set airplanes on fire for disaster drills. They really it's like summer camp in some ways. I was an officer. I've been told by my husband that being enlisted isn't quite so much summer camp. But anyway, I was stationed at Maxwell in Montgomery, Alabama.
And we have a picture of you in your blue uniform with your cap. You were a second lieutenant?
I was a second lieutenant when I went in, and I was a captain when I came out.
And you were in Alabama for 3 years. And that really is where your life, that as we know it, it really changed. So first tell me, what was life like there? What were you doing there? I know you were a physical therapist. What was life like?
I lived off base in an apartment. My husband was a student.
Well, you got married,
I
December
got
69.
married. Yeah, I got married very soon after I reported for active duty. And, you know, I went to work at the hospital, and I had a normal life off base.
You were 21, I think, when you got married, 22?
Yeah, 22.
And where was he a student? What was he?
Huntington.
In Montgomery.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this is, your marriage sort of brings us right to why we're here this evening.
Sure.
And so just to kind of set things up, there was a congressional statute that stated that members of the military with dependents were entitled to an extra monthly allowance of $120
At my pay grade, yes.
at your
100,
pay
yeah.
grade.
It was basically 1 week's worth of pay.
So you earned about $500 a month.
Mm-hmm.
And this money was for housing and medical, dental benefits.
Yes, he would get medical and dental care on the base. Yeah.
And so you said, great, you know, I'm going to go
Sign me up.
Sign me up.
Yeah, sign me up.
And you went to the payroll office with your marriage license, applied for these benefits for your husband, and what happened?
Or they said, no, you can't have this. And remember, I didn't have a lot of sophistication. I had zero sophistication. So when I encountered the no, I thought they were wrong. You know, I went from, you know, up the ladder a bit.
Like there was
talking
an error. There was a clerical error.
Oh, there was a clerical error. Some of these were good old boys, and they didn't like me. They didn't like women in the service. They made that really clear. You don't belong here. You know, what's wrong with your husband? Why isn't he supporting you? You know, comments like that. I thought that they had it wrong, and they were misogynists, and it was an individual thing. And so I went through the steps I could go through.
Maybe they were misogynist, but they had it right.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that was the only problem. And so one of the really important things here is where I was. I mean, I was in the city where Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, where Martin Luther King had his church, where the freedom fighters were beaten badly. You know, this was the city that was the heartland of civil rights. And so there was a law partnership there, Levin and Dees, which would, 6 months after they filed my case, would morph into the Southern Poverty Law Center. But an important part of why I was the one who filed this kind of suit was that there was opportunity. There was this law firm here to do it. But I was still naive, and when I first went to, I saw Joe Levin. Morris Dees was off working for McGovern.
Before we even get to going to the actual law firm, just to understand, you spent a few months sort of trying to work your way up the chain of command, right?
Did.
Like who?
Yeah.
So who were some of the kind of folks you were speaking? What were their positions on the base?
Well, I started with payroll and worked up to the hospital commander, and then I actually went to the base commander. You know, I didn't think everybody was a misogynist or stupid. I thought they just had it wrong. They just didn't understand that this was so patently unfair that it must be wrong.
Did they explain that benefits on the base depended on sex? Did they explain the way this worked?
They must have. I just don't remember.
And do you remember how it worked? Like, do you remember the sort of nitty gritty of the statute? Like,
Yes.
so
yes.
tell us about that.
It was that it wasn't as obvious as men get it and women don't. Women could, of course, get the allowance. You just had to prove that your husband was dependent on you for more than 1/2 of his part of the household expenses. So, you know, my 50% and more than 50% of his 50%, you know, and I couldn't prove that. He was on the GI Bill and he was working nights.
What was his job?
He worked as a night watchman in a vinegar factory. I went with him a couple of times, and it was spooky at night.
And he was, as a Navy veteran, he was earning like $200
Yeah. I mean, we weren't.
a month.
Yeah.
So if a woman is married to a man on the base, she automatically gets these benefits. And if it's the other way around, the woman has to show that she earns more than half of his
half.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And so
That she earns more than 3/4 of the whole household expense.
Okay, not fair. And you, it's your husband who says, let's go to a lawyer.
Yeah, he said
right?
enough of going through all of these.
And you mentioned the law firm Levin and Dees. These become very famous lawyers. They found the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Morris Dees and Joe Levin.
Yeah, and did your husband Joe know about this law firm already?
He would remember, he was the intellectual. He knew a lot more about a lot of what was going on in the world than I did. Yeah.
And you know, history often turns on these sort of remarkable coincidences. I mean, you weren't, or just, you know, not a coincidence, but just how fortunate for all of us that the lawyer who was right there, you know, this law firm, that it was these guys, you know.
Yes.
They were quite something. And so you go there, you tell them what happens when you go there. You explain, what was their reaction? What did you say to them?
Well, Morris was out. Morris Dees was out working for McGovern, so Joe Levin was there. And he said, and I said, I want you to write me a nice letter. I want you to just explain what they have wrong, because I'm sure that's all it's going to take. And he's really the first one I heard say, I can't help you. I cannot write any kind of letter that can get this for you. You know, this is a law, and the only way to change a law is to go to court, and you have to be willing to do that. And you have to be willing to pay for it, too, because we paid for...
$800.
We paid $800, which was a month and a half's pay.
Wow.
And I think we agreed to 1,000, but it luckily came in at 800. Yes.
And when I spoke to Joe, and
Yes, you did.
it was a delight.
He's a nice man, isn't he?
He's an amazing man, and he loves you. And he said to me, of that first meeting, he said, I don't think she appreciated the full potential of the case. She just wanted help. He kept saying to me, like, she had no understanding that this was going to be a big deal.
And
you just wanted what was due you, the
I'm
money that
not
was
sure
due
I
you.
would have gone through with it.
Had you
I
not.
mean, one of the important reasons, and Joe and I talk about this all the time, you know, why me? You know, why was I the one who walked into that office? It was because I was so naive, I could not see the future of it. If somebody had said to me, well, sure, get yourself a lawyer and end up going to the Supreme Court, I'm not sure I wouldn't have said, boy, you're not talking about me. You know, I don't want this kind of trouble.
And your husband was the co-defendant.
Yes.
And so at the time, Joe Levin was working with the lawyer Morris Dees, we mentioned, but also he then, once he takes your case, he's working with the future legal scholar Charles Abernathy.
Yes.
And so you had, you know, quite
Quite
a
the team.
remarkable little team
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
And you file suit in December of 1970.
I didn't, he did.
They
Yeah,
do.
Yeah.
And I know you didn't have a firm grasp at the time on sort of the legal side of things, what they were.
I'm not sure I have a firm grasp now.
Now, okay.
But,
Well, I guess you didn't need to. You know, you were
No.
what you had to do was, and it's not an
Was
easy
to
thing
just
to
walk
be the
in, yeah,
plaintiff.
yeah.
Before we turn to the legal side of things, do you have, you know, you said you and Joe talk about it sometimes. Do you have a thought as to what it was that made you be the one to have the guts? I know you said you didn't know what was coming down the road, but
Right.
still, you had to do that.
Well-
there were a lot of other women on the base
Right,
who,
right.
who,
And-
who
and
didn't
Jo-
do that.
Joe says that, when I say, because there are things I really don't like, and one of them is this fawning. You were a great heroine of blah, blah, blah. No, I wasn't. When the going got tough, I went and got a lawyer. I mean, there are women who have done extraordinary things. So, I keep making the point that this was a piece of law that was going to happen. Somebody sometime was going to file this lawsuit. And Joe keeps saying, and yet you are the one who walked into my office. And yet you are the one. And so there was some combination of naivete, him being there in the very town where I worked, and my being stubborn. I mean, just being angry. I was angry.
Well, that's not a small thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I know from writing about Roe, the desperation of the lawyers who filed Roe to find a plaintiff.
Yeah.
It's a very important thing. And you shouldn't sell yourself short. That is not a small thing. And in fact, as we'll get to a little bit later, you had an interesting conversation with Justice Ginsburg, who disagreed with your characterization of yourself. But we're jumping
We're
ahead.
not there yet.
We're not there yet. So the lawsuit argues that these military statutes, they violated the Fifth Amendment's due process clause by unreasonably discriminating on the basis of sex. They file a class action lawsuit. It's Frontiero v. Laird, because Melvin Laird was then the Secretary of Defense. It becomes Frontiero v. Richardson in 1973 with Elliot Richardson.
Right.
And you're suing the Defense Department. And what I found interesting, you told me at the time when we first talked about this, I said, this is an important sort of issue of gender equality, and you said, well, I was not thinking about that at the time. I was not a feminist at the time.
No.
So tell me a little bit about that.
I did not start as a feminist. I just wanted my money. It wasn't until we filed suit, and then, when you start to see, you don't unsee. When you
That's
start
right.
to see, you see what's next to it, and what's next to it, and what's next to it. And, I credit my first husband with very little, but I will credit him with this, I credit him with teaching me the pleasure of thinking, and I credit the lawsuit with teaching me what a bigger world it was and how much more complicated it was. And remember, this was during the second wave of feminism, and everything was happening. There were consciousness-raising groups, there were rallies, there were, all kinds of feminist things going on. And so I started going.
Women not getting jobs, not getting
Right.
promotions.
Right, but there was all kinds of pushback from women and women getting together. And so I got involved in that as well.
And so you quickly became a feminist.
I became a feminist, and when I die, the last cell that disappears from my body will be a feminist one. I promise you.
That's great. So let me ask you a question. What was the reaction on the base to your suit? I'm sure everyone quickly, word went around.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, there's Sharon. She filed
Yeah.
that lawsuit.
There was a lot of warning ahead of time, and the two things that were always said, if you're going to cause trouble, was, you're not going to get promoted, and they're going to send you to Thule, Greenland.
To where?
Thule, Greenland. That was
Thule,
the big
Greenland.
threat. Thule,
Okay.
Greenland. You're going to go to Thule, Greenland. And it occurs to me now that would have been interesting. But that was more like friendly warning. I think, when I filed to... Maxwell Air Force Base is the Air University. It still is. And very top-heavy, very intelligent people. And they were fine with it. They were. A lot of people thought this was something, the time had come. A lot of people wanted to argue with me, but they'd come to I could see them coming down the corridor. I knew they were coming to talk feminism with me. And, but they basically just wanted to argue it, intellectually.
How many other women were on the base with you?
I don't know how many.
Were a lot or just a handful?
There were women in the hospital,
Okay.
but not, I think I have in my notes that there were like 1 million men and 6,000 women
Yep.
in the service.
Yep.
But
And the district court, we'll get to that in a minute, they use that as part of their
Yeah.
reason to say, we don't want to overturn these statutes.
yeah,
So you did tell me that at one point you received a threatening letter.
oh, my famous threatening letter.
what did that
I
say?
I wasn't really afraid,
What
I actually.
did it say?
Oh, I wish I had saved it. About 3 months after I passed it around to everybody, in the clinic, men from somewhere came and took it away to fingerprint it. Little past time for that. And then I didn't have the wherewithal to copy it. So what I remember of it, it was along the lines of, you, commie, dyke, married to your fag, whatever husband, how would you like to have, your throat slit some night? And the postmark was from Virginia or something. I never really took it seriously. I thought some nutcase had just blown off a little steam.
The fact that you didn't take that seriously, I think, is another sort of just part of who you are. How this,
Right.
no, how you ended up. Other people would not have been the people, the plaintiff, and they would have been horrified when their life was threatened, and you just sort of brush it off and keep marching forward.
It kind of was a different time than today, I think. I don't know why I didn't take it that seriously. I just thought it was like an artifact, an interesting artifact.
Well, the case progresses. It goes to the district court for the Middle District of Alabama in Montgomery. 3 judges, April 1972, and you lose 2-1.
Right.
And the court said that basically overturning the statute would be inefficient because of what you said. It would require assessing the dependency status of every married male service member. There were, as you mentioned, 1 million enlisted men, but just 6,000 married women in the military. So they say, that examining the dependency of husbands is much less arduous. Therefore, we're going to keep it the way it is.
Right, but too expensive to give it to the women. Too expensive, but too onerous to do the paperwork for the men. And there was a line in that that said something like, women weren't being denied a right, men were just given a windfall.
Wow. What was, were you?
That was 1 week's pay a month windfall that all of them were getting.
Yeah. And your lawyer, Joe, he files an appeal. The case advances to the Supreme Court, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg soon gets involved. Before we get into all of that, how are you feeling? You had just lost. Were you disappointed, nervous, aloof from it all? How were you feeling?
I was disappointed. I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. I didn't understand how anybody could find that
Not
decision.
compelling. Yeah.
Right. However, I then left the service, came back home. My marriage was aflame, and I didn't have a whole lot of focus left for this. While I was, it was a personally very bad time. And one of the things I kind of regret is that when the Supreme Court decision came in, and it should have been a real time for celebration, first of all, I was very far away from the people who had been involved with me.
You were back now
I
in
was back home.
Massachusetts. Yep.
I really hadn't, built myself a network there, and my marriage was so painful that it was really one of the most dismal personal times in my life at that time.
You weren't able to enjoy it. Well, before we get to sort of...
But it wasn't a birthday party, so I'm not going to weep over this, okay? So.
Understood. So I don't think you were paying much attention to what Joe Levin and and the future Justice Ginsburg were sort of hashing out between them. But let's go over it a little bit for all of you, because it's really fascinating. So I spoke to Joe, as you know, and he helped me kind of understand everything that happened next. So he files the appeal, and when he does that, the ACLU reaches out to him. And Ginsburg had just founded the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And your lawyer respected her, he respected her work. He also recognized that her prominence could help the case. He was 27 years old. You told me you couldn't believe that he was just 3 years older than you at the time.
When I went into his office, he was a grown-up, and I was not. That was my perception. And when I saw him again 42 years later, I was to meet him again 42 years later, I looked at him and said, how is it you're not older than I am?
It's bizarre, yes.
It was so bizarre.
He was just 27 then. She was 40. And Joe told the ACLU when they reached out that he was open to having Ruth Bader Ginsburg write the draft of the jurisdictional statement.
Right.
And perhaps, and that word perhaps caused some problems, perhaps through the oral argument. The ACLU then took it as a given that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would do the oral argument. And they were soon at real odds with one another, not only over who would argue, but what they would argue.
Yeah.
And so did you know any of this? Nothing. It was just they're handling my case. And
I have likened this to being a patient, on the gurney who's wheeled off to surgery and anesthetized, and the surgeons do all the work.
yeah.
So no, the case just sort of went somewhere else.
And you, as you say, you leave the base, you're honorably discharged in 1972, back to Gloucester, Mass. Your husband goes to work at a shipyard there, right, in New Hampshire.
Okay.
And are you now working as a physical therapist?
Yeah.
Okay. And then sort of back on the ranch, back in Montgomery, the ACLU chief, Melvin Wolf, told Joe that he wanted the ACLU to take over the case. And what's fascinating is you can read these letters that Joe and Ginsburg are writing to each other. And she writes to him, I am not very good at self-advertisement, but believe you have some understanding of the knowledge of the women's rights area I have developed over the past 2 years. She then adds that she thought it would be best for a woman attorney to argue the case. And he writes back to her wondering as to how he and his colleagues had, quote, become assistants in his own case. He doesn't understand. And there's real tension there. And then Justice Ginsburg, she has a wonderful suggestion. She says, well, how about this? I'll file an amicus brief. And he agrees, and he further suggests that he will share some of his time with the oral arguments. He's going to give her 10 of his 30 minutes. And so they come to this sort of détente, this sort of agreement, and history is the better for it. And the case is argued in front of the Supreme Court January 17th, 1973. You were not there.
I was not there.
Why were you not there?
Joe, I've told you this story. Joe called me up a couple of years ago, and I'm always asked this. I get asked two questions regularly at talks. One is, what was she like? All right? And the other one is, what did it feel like to be in the Supreme Court when your case is being argued? And I wasn't there. And so, Joe knew that I got asked that question. I was on a panel with him when I got asked that question.
Many years later.
Many years later, yeah. And so he called me up and he said, Sharon, I really have to tell you why I didn't invite you to the Supreme Court. And I thought he was going to say, well, because you're such a loose cannon, I didn't know what you were going to do. But what he said was, I didn't know I could. And he was 3 years older than I was. And
His first time in the Supreme
it
Court,
was his
too.
first time in the Supreme Court. And he'd been holed up apparently in a motel room with Chuck Abernathy going over it. And no, he didn't know any more than I did. We were children in our 20s,
Wow. By the way,
which is what makes history,
Yeah.
is children in their 20s.
yeah,
So,
5 days before that case was argued, your case was argued.
yeah, the big one.
The Roe ruling.
Yeah.
5 days after, excuse me. And tell me what your reaction to that was.
Oh, wonderful. Every feminist thought that was wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite a week in
Yeah,
the court.
and it was, I mean, like I said, this was the second wave of feminism, and it was a juggernaut coming down the pike. I mean, man, we were making the world better for everybody,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
wow! And it was exciting,
Wow.
yeah.
And so in the Supreme Court on that day, and Dean Mackenzie, you mentioned that you listened to the oral arguments just now. Joe Levin and the future Justice Ginsburg, they argue very differently
Yes.
on your behalf.
Yep.
Joe argues much more narrowly, the rational basis test. He's saying that given the clear discrimination against women in the armed forces, the statute is unconstitutional. And I asked him about that. He said, I was representing a client and a class of people. I just wanted to make sure that she got what she was entitled to, which, by the way, was about $2,200.
Yeah, yeah.
And Justice Ginsburg argued that the same strict scrutiny standard that applied in cases about race ought to apply to cases about gender discrimination. So she's arguing, you know, on a much sort of broader level,
Yeah.
not narrowly focused on
Yeah.
you. And her argument becomes sort of legendary, and it finishes with a famous flourish that we'll hear right now. She quotes an 1837 quip by the abolitionist Sarah Grimke. Here, let's listen.
In asking the court to declare sex a suspect criterion, amicus urges a position forcibly stated in 1837 by Sarah Grimke, noted abolitionist and advocate of equal rights for men and women. She spoke, not elegantly, but with unmistakable clarity. She said, I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks. In conclusion,
It's quite something.
Well said,
Yeah.
well said.
Well said. You were the instrument of that. It's very, it's amazing. And that is now on.
Not single-handedly.
No, not
I did not
single-handedly.
make that woman's career,
No, I would agree.
yeah,
Although this was the first time she was in the Supreme Court.
still,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And that is now on thousands of T-shirts. You
I
see it
know,
all
I
over
know,
this,
I
all
know,
over the
I
place.
know.
So a few months go by, and you are, as you mentioned, sort of suffering in your marriage. But we'll get to that in a moment. May 1973.
We don't have to get to that.
Okay, we don't have to. May 73, you win. The Supreme Court rules in your favor 8-1. Rehnquist is the lone, Justice Rehnquist is the lone dissent. The statute is unconstitutional. It's a pivotal ruling. It's the first successful sex discrimination case filed against the federal government, and the court is divided over its reasoning. When I spoke to Joe, Joe Levin, he said that he didn't think that there would be sort of a majority of justices that would go for the strict scrutiny that Justice Ginsburg was calling for, and he was right. There were 4 justices who echoed her call for that. Other justices asserted only that the military statute was irrational. But setting that aside, it was really a great victory for the cause of gender equality. Tell me, what do you remember of that day? How did you feel?
Well, a reporter showed up. And I had been fielding reporters all along. I was sort of, I was out of the legal loop, but I was the Vanna White, of the case. So reporters would come to me for, the face of it. And so we learned about it, actually, from a reporter who came, who was one of the better ones. There were reporters and there were reporters over the years.
And you got telegrams.
And I got telegrams from friends, yeah.
I mean, did you have a great, I know you got your money, but did you feel?
When they gave me my money, I was divorced, and they split it and gave half to Joe and half to me, and I thought, I suppose I should feel this is fair.
Although, One of the things you actually told me about that, you said, in the divorce, you were the one, you didn't get a lot. It was not an amicable divorce, but you did get the lawsuit.
I
So
got the lawsuit.
Tell me a little bit about that.
We also had a snake, and I got the snake. But anyway, the lawsuit, yeah, because it was a woman's.
What do you mean by that? That you got the lawsuit? History attached you to it?
Yeah, people have forgotten Joe. People have forgotten both of the Joes, actually. They've forgotten that Joe Levin was the lawyer. He was my primary lawyer. And they have forgotten that my former husband was my co-plaintiff.
And in fact, when
And that bothered him. That bothered him a lot, because I stayed in touch with his mother, and she would tell me occasionally.
I think it
how it bothered
bothered
him.
both Joes.
I think it bothered both of them, yeah, I know.
Yeah, and when there was a recent, documentary film, a very popular one about Justice Ginsburg, and he's not even mentioned, right? When Frontiero is
Yeah,
discussed.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's unfortunate.
That kind of blew up, I think, in the Southern poverty law circle. Why aren't you mentioned in this film? Yeah.
Yeah. Stepping back just a
It's
moment.
because history is written according to what people want to hear.
Yeah.
And the story was about the plucky little lieutenant and her plucky little lawyer. That was the story people wanted to hear, and they didn't want to hear other nuances.
Absolutely. You, speaking of nuance, you described yourself that week to the New York Times as a flaming feminist.
Oh dear, yeah.
And and there's a great article that I read, and you called out "hot damn" when you got a call from the reporter. It was a very exciting moment. Your family was proud of you, and yet what I wanted to ask you about now, at the same time, being a flaming feminist, you told me you were suddenly really uncomfortable being held up as a model of feminism. You're just 26 years old. Tell us a little bit about that. How you're feeling.
Yeah.
What made you uncomfortable?
Well, just that. Suddenly there was this expectation that I would be changing the oil in my car, that I would be doing the things that a good feminist should be doing, and I have never felt that I should be held to. I mean, my version of feminism is that, we're all free to do what we can do as long as we can support ourselves and not hurt each other. So, I shouldn't have to be what a feminist now tells me a feminist is,
Yeah, absolutely.
So are you going to announce what I...
Not yet.
Not yet.
We're getting there. We're getting there. Before we get
Move
to
it
that,
along. Move it along.
Before we get to that, you get married, remarried, you get divorced, and
I
then
got divorced.
remarried 5 years later.
Yeah.
And you have a son, and you become a housewife, and you become, that was the word you used when
Yeah,
on the
okay.
phone.
Yeah.
And you told me, great delight in being a feminist who was a stay-at-home mom. So tell us a little bit about that.
I did stuff at home. I did write and volunteer, but
But being a mom was at that point your most important job.
oh yeah, I loved it. And I loved having the privilege of being able to stay home, run play group, volunteer in the school. I loved all of that. And I think that sometimes in my most pessimistic moments, I think that what feminists, what I won for women today is the mandate to work rather than the right to work. So it was a great privilege to be able to choose to work when I wanted to and at what I wanted to, rather than,
Yeah. And you're in Gloucester.
Gloucester.
Gloucester,
Let me-
excuse me. Yep. And you did not.
We're touchy about that in
No,
Gloucester.
I'm sorry. I actually Googled how do you pronounce it, and I got it
And
wrong
you got it
anyway. Yeah.
Well, maybe they told you that pronunciation.
I just blew it. So you were not a member of all of these sort of local feminist groups, the Cape Ann Feminists of the cities?
I was in a consciousness-raising group, but no, I didn't. I'm not much of a joiner. I'm a little touch oppositional.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that has led you right here. And all of these, well, let's get now to what my favorite thing that I discovered in speaking to you about this. So in the early 1980s, you mentioned now that you started writing. Tell us, what were you writing?
romance novels.
Romance novels, of
Because
course.
I read one and I thought, oh, I could do this.
Yeah, here they are. I have to tell you, they're really great.
Well, you haven't read a whole one yet. You
I'm
only read the
almost
first
done
couple
with
of
High
pages.
Country.
Okay.
All right, and here we go. Here's Cold Comfort, and this is my favorite. I could not, it was not available on Amazon. I tried. The Pirate's Key.
I'm amazed you got even one.
I know, I was very excited about that. I was excited about that. So, I mean, you are forging your own path. Not a lot of sort of, plaintiffs of Supreme Court cases about women's rights become romance novelists.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might be the only one.
And then, I wrote 4 of those. And I'm very, career ADD. Once I've done something a couple of times, I go and do something else. So I have written other things. I've written, when I was a library aide, I wrote a set of mysteries to teach kids how to look things up, research mysteries, and that got published. There were a couple of editions of it. And I've done, newsletters, and I did something for the local museum called the Time Ship, which was history newsletters that went once a month into the middle schools. So I've continued to write, but just whatever I feel like.
Well, I'm not ready to let this go just yet. I just want to ask you, is there something to it? Is it accurate to look into this and say, okay, here you are saying you are uncomfortable with expectations being sort of foisted upon me. Look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it my own way. Is there something there?
I'm not sure it was quite like, watch me do this. It was more like, oh, this is interesting. I could do this, I'm only going to go around once. I don't believe I'm coming back. So, I've got this one wild and precious life, to quote Mary Oliver. So I might as well have a good time. If I can have a good time.
That's wonderful.
At whatever comes
next. A life well lived. Yeah.
Or at least, yes.
Yeah.
Amusingly lived, yeah.
Yeah, amusingly lived. Things were not only, though, you were still struggling a little bit with what you had taken upon yourself, you told me. Like, these years are passing by, and in 1993, Justice Ginsburg joins the court, and all of a sudden, the sort of press rediscovers you. A bunch of people are reaching out to you. And you said this was very hard. You got the question, what are you doing now? Tell us a little bit.
Why aren't you a lawyer? I was saying to Anna earlier, it's, everybody wanted to know that. Now that you've had this lawsuit, are you going to go to law school and become a lawyer? And it's no more sensible for me to become a lawyer than if, as you pointed out, if I had a heart attack, I would become a doctor. But there were expectations. It's really nice to be old. There's a lot to be said for being old. And one of them is that people have stopped asking me when I'm going to go to law school. The statute of limitations has run out on that one. There was a whole middle ground there. Right when the lawsuits were filed, when I got a lot of attention from both reporters and other people and didn't like it. I was not fully formed as a human being yet, and I didn't like expectations and didn't know what to do with them. And there were people who liked me because I was kind of like a charm on their bracelet. There were people who didn't like me because they resented me. The one woman said to me, well, you're so lucky you have a lawsuit. And, I just didn't know why stuff was coming at me.
Yeah.
And then there was a great long period when I was largely forgotten, when I just was sort of left to grow up the way everybody needs to grow up. And then you're right, she made the court, and I was rediscovered. And now instead of wanting to know about the lawsuit, everybody wanted to know about her.
Yeah.
What was she like?
Yeah.
What were you two like when you braided each other's hair back in the dorm? And I had to explain that I, first of all, didn't even meet her for 26 years after the lawsuit was over. And I met her because the people at the Women's Memorial put together a panel discussion with other women who had done legal things with the military. And we were going to, she wasn't on the panel.
This is 1999.
1999, right. And they were doing a fundraising calendar. So I went over to the Supreme Court, and there was me and General Gene Home, who was the first general in the military, and she came out. This is where we're getting to the story, right?
Yeah, it's
Of
a
what
great
you told me.
story.
It is. She came out. She came, I think she was ill at the time. She looked really frail. And the three of us are standing there with the photographer and the photographer's assistants and those great big, umbrella things. And she and I are talking, and she's saying, well, you changed your name. And I said, do you? And
Did she look frowningly upon that
oh,
you
no,
changed your
She
name?
said, you changed your name. And I said, I just like a little distance. And she said, okay. And she was so uncomfortable. I said, do you have to do this often? And she said, no, mainly they let me work. And then that was lovely. And she went back into the building. My husband and my son, who was in high school, that's how much time had passed, were there and told me that the photographer was really annoyed that we kept talking, that he wasn't getting his good shots. But anyway, somebody came out and invited us into the court, and we all went trooping in, including the cute little photographer's assistants. And I'm from the sticks. I don't know what's going on here, so I didn't know whether going into the court was a big deal or not. So I turned to the assistants, in the elevator, and said, "Is this a big deal to be going up to her chambers?" And they said, "We were excited just to meet you." So we go up and meet everybody, and she gives everybody a little talk in her office. And as we're about to leave, she hugs me, which surprised me quite a bit. She hugs me and she says, "It's okay to be a hero." Came out of the blue because I didn't even know that she knew that I had those reservations.
She wanted you to own your part in history and be proud of it.
I guess. I don't know. I don't know. But it was so surprising to me that I had to say to my husband and son, "Remember this because I'm not sure I'm going to." So, but yeah.
That's an amazing thing to be told by
Justice Ginsburg.
By a justice.
Yeah. And then after that, we started she invited me to a conference in New York, and that's where I met probably the worst reporter I've ever met in my life. Because a reporter wanted to talk to me, and lawyers are an interesting group of people. Lawyers really do things, in old-fashioned, very particular ways. So I was told the reporter wanted to talk to me, so I was taken to the place where the reporter would meet me, and then the reporter, who was a fairly young woman, showed up, and then the lawyer backed away. It was very ritualized. And the reporter said, "Now, what was she like back when the lawsuit was?" And I said, "I don't know. I didn't know her then." And she said, "Oh," and she snapped her notebook shut and turned around and walked away.
Lovely.
I thought there could be a few other questions, but anyway.
Well, we're coming sort of
But
towards.
so anyway, we've had over the years after that, we got into She was a very gracious woman. She was very cordial. We had a relationship where I would send her a Christmas card and she would send me a little piece of bling. And she had a lot of bling. She had, I think, boxes of bling. And she would send me Supreme Court bookmarks and speeches she'd given where she referenced me with, coffee stains all over it. And, but the best bling she ever sent me, and I have brought it somewhere here. Here it is. When I had told her that my daughter-in-law was pregnant again after having lost the first baby, she sent me this little T-shirt, RBG Grand Clerk. and she said, to make it even more gracious, she said, hang on to it until you know everything's okay, and then give it to your daughter-in-law. So both of my grandchildren have now stained this, this artifact.
That's beautiful. That's really special. And would you say that comment that she had, the answer is no, I trust you to tell me no. Did it in any way occasion a change in you and your relationship to your plaintiffship where she said, it's okay to be a hero? Did that have an effect on you and the way you looked at your role in history?
I'm still uncomfortable with the whole hero business. And let's go back to the alcoholism in my family. This is I have a very low bar for bullshit. I really don't like stuff that's overinflated, that's not genuine. And so I really don't like all of that business. A window opened in front of me. I stepped through the window. Mm-hmm. I did the business I had to do there, and I stepped back. That's what I did. That's what I did. And, history or, the grace of whatever has delivered me this delicious piece of business. I mean, now I'm a living fossil of history here. And I get invited. I mean, you guys flew me to New York. Thank you very much. This is a treat. And you promised me I would be loved by the crowd, so you know what your expectation is here. It's very pleasant. It's very pleasant to be living out this Vanna White, of the law role. But I'm no hero, and I've seen heroes. I did a panel at Maxwell right before the pandemic where there were women. I mean, women are now in combat zones. Women are doing serious things in serious places. And there was one woman who had been in Vietnam. She was a nurse, and she followed the man she loved, and the man she loved did not make it back. And she described some of that. Nobody wanted to follow her after her descriptions. There was another woman, a younger woman who had been in Afghanistan, who described a situation I had said that I thought that it was tougher for women now, because back when I filed this lawsuit, it was really clear, the pay was not equal.
Yep.
Whatever you wanted to call it, the benefits were not equal, the money was not equal, it was real clear. Now, you're not quite clear what's going on. If you don't get advanced, well, we're back to, you just individually don't, measure up. This woman, and boy, she was tough. She had been really put upon by her training sergeant, and he was really tough on her, and she thought he was just trying to make her a better soldier. And finally, she went to the officer in command and told him, I have to drop out because I can't make it. I clearly can't make it. And she told him what had happened, and much to his credit, he said, not you, it isn't you. And the sergeant was disciplined for the harassment. But she said it took her a long time to recover from that because she had so individualized it. Mm-hmm. So, these are the women I've met in the service. They're doing real stuff.
Yep.
You know, again, when the going cut tough, I got a
You
lawyer.
got a lawyer. Well, two final questions for me, and then we'll see if other folks have questions. So you mentioned to me sort of, how over the last 20 years or so, you have become more comfortable with your plaintiffship. And you mentioned that part of that owes, you think, to Al-Anon.
Yes.
And that,
Well, just being more comfortable as a human being, I owe to Al-Anon. Yes.
you also said sort of more particularly that it gave you the perspective about to sort of relax your vigilance, in a way, not only about alcoholism, but your
Yeah.
plaintiffship. And
Yeah.
so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, I'm not sure I can tell more than what you've just told. But
Okay.
yes, no, it's true.
Well,
It's,
you said to me that you saw sort of a parallel between feminism and living among alcoholics. What you meant by that is, and I'm quoting, the individual is stressed, but something larger is at work. Do you remember saying that?
I don't, but it's lovely.
Yeah.
I think I'll use it. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Comment? Talk among
That's all.
yourselves.
And the last thing I wanted to
He's
ask.
very easy to talk to. He's very
We've
easy to talk to.
established,
It's
yeah.
scary how easy he is to talk to. And my husband was passing me notes. You're talking to a reporter. You're talking to a reporter. So
Are you upset about anything you divulged here this
you've
evening?
been very nice.
Okay, well, I'm
Yeah.
not pretending. These are my actual
Yeah.
questions I wish
Yeah.
to ask.
And that I don't remember everything I said to you
That's
doesn't mean
okay.
that
We
I was
spoke
out
a long
of
time.
out of control of what I've said to you.
No,
I've
not
been,
at all.
I've, you know.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about, you wrote something for the Gloucester, did I get it right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's very good.
A magazine just recently. And you talked about anger
Sure.
that you have
Yeah.
inside. Can you tell us a little bit
This
about
is
that?
this was actually a book for Gloucester is having its 400th celebration, and so this was a retrospective of history. And I had been asked to write about consciousness raising groups and the 70s, and I talked about being asked to be on a panel that never happened.
Because of COVID.
Because of COVID, and then the whole thing was canceled after that. It was to be a panel of men and me, and the only reason I was on the panel is that Joe Levin asked for me to be on the panel, and it was going to be on men's contributions to the women's rights movement, and perfectly legitimate thing. And here's my lawyer who's won the case for me. And I considered being on that panel, and as I thought about what I wanted to say, I just realized I was angry. I was really angry. And it went back to this, lifting your foot off the necks of women. And it was like, am I going to sit here and praise men for lifting, like a toe? And I was taken aback by how angry I was. I was surprised because, I live among you, men. I live among you. Quite peacefully most of the time. And so I started asking other women and found out that there's this real layer of anger among women, and not just my generation of women. I think, 50 years ago, we thought the world was going to be different. And the world is still tough, and it's still tough because we got number one on the list. We got entrance into the workplace, but we didn't get anything to support it, like decent child care or elder care or anything that would support that. And the culture is still there, and it's now more subtle and harder to define. So, and not only that, when I was talking to women, I said I sent you the article. I was talking about, instead of wounds, what we have is 100 little paper cuts. you know, the not being listened to. Right? You're nodding away back here. And also I talked to my niece, who was in her late 20s, and said, what's it like to be a woman in relationship to men these days? And she said, I know that you want me to tell you that things are much better, but in fact I spend a considerable amount of my energy keeping myself safe from men. And she described closing up the business she ran in Boston at night, and if she missed the bus and had an hour to wait, she had to start strategizing how to be safe. And we do live in a society where not every man is a rapist and a murderer. Not every woman gets raped and murdered, but you just have to do it to one to make everybody else stay home. And so a lot of women, I found out, carry a certain amount of anger that the world is not more equitable and more safe like we had wanted it to be 50 years ago. So
It's a sobering note to end on, but I think an important one. And there are a lot of people who feel exactly as you do. And obviously Roe was overturned last year. I mean, there's a lot that is very depressing for the
there's
world
a real
that you have
wall.
been a part of.
I think that we were naive in not thinking that life was going to be difficult for us in a lot of ways. But there's a real wall that's pushing back now, which is scary. So,
Do we have any questions?
please ask me questions. Or make comments.
So I'm going to do something which is to note two things. Then Justice Rehnquist was the sole dissenter, as Joshua said. He didn't write a dissenting opinion in Frontiero. There's simply a notation. Mr. Justice Rehnquist dissents for the reasons stated by Judge Rives in his opinion for the district court. See citation. When Jesse Furman and I were clerking at the Supreme Court, the court decided a case called Nevada against Hibbs, which involved the constitutionality of the Family and Medical Leave Act, and in particular provisions that would allow family care. And now Chief Justice Rehnquist, again dissenter in Frontiero, wrote the following in the majority opinion upholding the constitutionality of the statute. Quote, Congress responded to this history of discrimination by abrogating state sovereign immunity, and we sustained this abrogation in C case. But state gender discrimination did not cease. Quotation. It can hardly be doubted that women still face pervasive, although at times more subtle discrimination in the job market, end quote. See Frontiero v. Richardson.
Oh.
So, and at the time that case was decided, there were a number of articles about how Rehnquist, who had been a dissenter in some of the early sex discrimination cases, ends up writing this very full-throated endorsement of congressional efforts to fight against the indirect lack of support in the ways that you just spoke of. And one of the articles, I will say, noted that his daughter was a working single mother and questioning whether or not perhaps living a little bit and seeing the world had turned him into a small f feminist as well. So
Nice.
I thought that was just a note to
Nice.
end on.
That's fascinating. Wow.
I also, can I add one more thing? I'm going to talk next week to a civics class at a local college, so it's a different kind of talk. So I've been also thinking about that. And one of the questions is, so what? Why should things be equal for women? And they should be equal for women simply because women deserve it. But the other thing is that if you believe that men and women are different, and I'm willing to entertain that. I don't know why, whether it's nature or nurture, who can tell at this point, but I'm willing to say that men and women may be different, and that usually what people say when they're generalizing like this is that men are aggressive and risk-taking, and women are cooperative and collaborative and much more caring. So why shouldn't these people be at the table? I mean, we're in a real mess. We should bring the collaborative, cooperative, caring people to the table. That's what we're missing.
Well, we brought you to the table. So
Thank you.
thank you very much, and thank all of you.